Dragon's Dogma 2 has been out officially for about a week now, and I figure what better time to post y'all some tips that you can use whenever you're playing your game. Now I got 50 tips for you guys today, and to make the video quick, we're just going to go through them rapid fire, so I hope you enjoy and hope you find a few you haven't heard yet. First, let's go through some tips for the settings, and there are 3 in particular I want you to pay attention to. Probably the most important one out of this entire list is if you are playing on a budget PC like myself, here are my specs here, then the dynamic resolution setting is going to be your best friend. It will dynamically adjust your image quality in order to keep up your frame rate. You can also set your frame rate to be capped if you're on PC so that you do not have to deal with any massive stutters. Also, if you're an MMO veteran and you prefer to have a further camera distance, you can adjust that here as well under the camera settings. This will allow you to see more of the battlefield, so whenever you're in the middle of a fight, you'll be able to make better decisions. And thirdly, if you're on controller, you can pretty much map any button to whatever you want. Immediately, the first thing I did whenever I booted up the game for the first time, I changed my vocation action to the left bumper instead of the right bumper. Because my background is mostly in the Elder Scrolls, The Witcher, and also Elden Ring, most of those block buttons are going to be on the left bumper anyway, so getting that over really helped out my gameplay. Same thing if you come from a shooter, then switching over to the left bumper will make it so that whenever you aim using your archer vocation, it'll be switched over to your left bumper, which is really handy in my opinion. Now let's move over to some tips for your pawns. If you yourself are not playing a mage, make sure you have at least one pawn that can fill that slot. It's very important in this game to have a source of healing that isn't your curatives, and a mage will fill in that slot just fine. And secondly, if you do choose to use a mage, make sure that you find one with the Meister's Teaching Celestial Paeon, which you can get pretty early on. This is an ability that allows you to have infinite stamina for a time, which pairs very well with the Mystic Spearhand vocation, especially if you want to use Wild Fury. The next tip I'm going to give you is to always make sure you have a member of your party that is either a fighter or a warrior, or otherwise some sort of aggro management. Especially if you're playing a ranged vocation, you're not going to have very many defenses, so it's important to make sure that there's at least one character on your team that is going to be highly defensive and taking most of the aggro. I personally would always recommend a fighter vocation over a warrior, but you could really do either on the higher levels. And on that note, if you're in the early game and you do happen to have a fighter or warrior, make sure that they have the ability Springboard or Ladder Launch so you can reach those hard to reach places. If you do choose to have a sorcerer pawn on your team, make sure that you pair it up with another sorcerer, because there is a mechanic in Dragon's Dogma 2 where sorcerers can actually sync up spells and reduce their cast time for more powerful and more frequent strikes. In my experience, pawns are very good about doing this at all times, so you want to make sure that you have at least 2 sorcerers if you're going to go that route for magic damage. If you're having trouble finding pawns with these specific traits or any specific traits that you want, you can always search for them in the Rift by interacting with the Rift Stone. By doing this, you can filter down by vocation, skills, and even quest knowledge if you want. And while you're in this menu, you can also set your pawn's quest. This can be useful for helping build another part of your pawns called the pawn badges. Pawn badges are these little achievements that your pawn can get, which indicate how much knowledge on whatever enemy type your pawn has experience dealing with. As pawns gain knowledge as they level up, it's very important to pay attention to your pawn badges, because usually the more pawn badges you have, the more knowledgeable your pawn will be about fighting whatever particular monster. So it's important to build these up over time, and you can set these as your pawn quest as mentioned before. While you're looking through the Rift to find whichever pawn to take with you, you can swap between your options using the bumper keys to then change your view to weapon skills, quest knowledge, and other information. And probably one of the most important traits of a pawn is to make sure that they look good, or at least look unique, so that you have more of a chance to get them hired. When players rent your pawns, there is a chance that they will give you items in return, and you also earn Rift Crystals, which can be used for more tips later down the road. So whether you want to make them ungodly ugly or beautiful and really show your talent for fashion's dogma is up to you, but I would advise making them as eye-catching as possible. That being said, there is a Rift store which is right next to the Vernworth Rift Stone, where you can spend Rift Crystals to buy different accessories that you can equip to your pawn. Not only will this allow you to buy Rift Incense, which will allow you to change your pawn's inclination, but it will also allow you to buy the Art of Metamorphosis, which can be used to edit both yourself and your pawn in character creation. And while this may seem like a steep price, it's actually very easy to earn as long as your pawn gets rented. So if you don't like the appearance of either yourself or your main pawn, you can always buy the Art of Metamorphosis. Now for when you're actually out venturing in the world, your pawns can also be useful in other ways as well. I personally like to use my pawns as pack mules, so any extra materials that are weighing me down are going to be immediately given over to my pawns. Furthermore, if you give items to your rented pawns that you can later dismiss, any items that you give them will promptly be returned to your item storage, so you don't have to worry about losing any items. One very important thing that I like to do with my port crystals is hand them over to my main pawn so that it doesn't weigh me down in a similar way. By doing this, I have a free port crystal that I can set anywhere that I want, so if I have to make a quick trip into town, I can just pop a fairy stone and then pop another one to be right back where I was. Another useful set of tips you'll want to know for your pawns is that you can actually use them to gauge your fall damage whenever you encounter a cliff. You can grab them and then throw them to see how much damage they'll take on the way down. Of course, this is always risky if you happen to deal too much damage to them, but if you're a magic archer, you can always use Remedy Arrow to then bring them back and then jump down yourself to have them catch you. So extra little bonus exploration tip if you happen to be a magic archer. And if you're not, well, just be more careful. You can also use the go command whenever you're out and about to have pawns guide you either on your quest, or if they have any suggestions for where items might be, they will lead you right to them if they've already found them in other worlds with other players. I found myself spamming the go command quite a lot whenever I'm playing Dragon's Dogma 2. And finally, for pawns, the last thing you want is a bad case of the Dragon's Plague that will ruin your save. I assume most of you have already heard of what this is, so if you happen to find a pawn who is acting erratically, like sprinting around when you're standing still, or is talking back to you in any way, just take some time to talk to them. When you have them up close and personal, make sure you pay attention to their eyes. They will either be blinking red or glowing red. If you happen to stumble across this, the easiest way to get rid of this, if you have a rented pawn, is to simply dismiss them, but if your main pawn has it, then that means they have a trip to the brine. Just simply toss them in any body of water and go recover them at any rift stone to cure their disease. I have found that this occurs more frequently whenever I'm fighting lesser dragons and drakes, so take that for what you will. And I ended up in a scenario where all three of my pawns had the Dragon's Plague after one of these fights, so I had to dismiss my entire team and toss my pawn in the brine, so be very careful if you're trying to fight drakes. Now we'll get into some more general tips. Food in your inventory will decay over time and will grant you the blighted status if you happen to eat it after it's gone rotten. One thing you can do to mitigate this is to have either you or your pawn have the stasis augment. This will slow down the rate at which food decays in your inventory, and this can be unlocked from the sorcerer vocation. And on that note, each vocation has augments that you can unlock as you play through them, and these augments can be equipped to any future vocation you happen to play. So if there's an augment that you want, make sure you grind that vocation to whatever level you need so that you can then equip that augment over to whichever other vocation you want to play. When you're out and about in the game world, there are some additional tips you can use if you're using the thief vocation as well. For starters, I found that his movement is a lot more smooth whenever you use the swift step vocation action and also pair it with a light attack. That way, instead of awkwardly pausing in between your movements, you're able to flow into the attack and then immediately start swift stepping again. You can also use Helm Splitter to get additional height off of your jumps, and if you have the footpad core skill unlocked, you can actually use it to jump off of obstacles to get to places you wouldn't normally be able to reach. And to assist you with that, if you find any of these breakable boxes that you can grab, you can actually stack one to then gain an extra height advantage if you want to jump. I have found that if you try to stack two, it will glitch out and start bleeding into each other, so make sure you only use one for this tip. But if you want to have a simpler time of reaching higher places, you can always make your character taller with longer limbs to not only increase its reach in battle, but also get extra height off of your jumps and be able to reach higher places. In that same vein, if you adjust your character's weight, a higher weight will mean that you start with extra max stamina, but it will drain faster and regen slower. So if you're lighter, that'll start with less maximum stamina, but it will regen faster and drain slower. If none of these seem to be helping you, you can always try to throw your pawns if you're trying to reach a treasure chest that's out of your reach or a platform that's out of your reach. Or if that's not helping you, you can always use these harpy smoke beacons, which will draw a harpy to your location that you can then grab onto and float around to whichever platform you're trying to reach. If you're out and about and want to have an easier time finding treasure and you have enough seeker tokens, you can go to the Vocation Guild and unlock these dowsing spikes, which will glow and ping whenever you're close to a treasure chest. Also, for a thief vocation, these weapons are actually pretty strong, so if you need a starter weapon and have enough seeker tokens, these are not a bad choice for damage. And finally, you'll find that some cities actually have built-in port crystals that you can activate if you happen to find them. In the overworld and the base game, I'll just go ahead and reveal that the cities Vernworth and Harv Village are the only two that have this feature, but there are more locations that unlock the later you go on in the story. So make sure that in these two locations locations especially that you unlock the port crystals for Vernworth and Harv Village. Moving on, if you happen to be playing a fighter, it's very important that you are able to time the true deflect core skill. This is an effect that occurs whenever you correctly time a block against any particular attack. The stamina drain effect will not occur whenever you correctly time this block, and it will also prevent any damage from coming your way as well. One thing that I like to do is hold my shield up, and whenever I see an attack about to come my way, I will start tapping my left bumper so that I can try to get the true deflect if I don't know the exact timing of any particular attack. If you happen to have a mage in your party, it's very important that you select the correct boons for them to grant to the rest of your party. Elemental weaknesses are very important in Dragon's Dogma 2 and will net increase damage against certain foes. So make sure you have the correct one kitted out on your mage at any given time. By the way, another bonus tip for mages is that if you happen to use their anodyne skill, it can actually damage undead such as skeletons, so that's an extra little tidbit for you. If you're out traveling and you know that you're coming up against a hard boss fight, you can actually use campsites to not only rest, but also just equip your skills if you need a quick swap. I like to use this if I know I'm about to fight a drake, which are usually weak to ice, and I will actually go up to a campsite and make sure that my mage pawn has ice boon or ice affinity equipped to them at all times. And you can do this for pretty much any enemy that you know you're about to face and you happen to know the elemental weakness of, so I'd highly recommend that you swap up your skills if you need to. If you happen to be fighting a large foe, it should be noted that most of these enemies have 3 different states that they can be in. They have their balanced phase, they have their wobbly phase, and then they have their down phase. When they are in the wobbly phase or off balance, you can always approach them and try to grab and shift their weight in order to make them collapse. It should be noted that most enemies have weak points at their head, so if you're going to be initiating an attack that might knock them off balance, you want to make sure to aim for the head. And likewise, if you do manage to down a specific monster, you can actually go up to their head and usually perform some sort of execution or riposte to get some extra damage if you're a melee class. When you're fighting these bigger monsters, it should be noted that if you're in such a position where you can actually stand on them without grabbing, I would recommend doing that, as it does actually regen your stamina and lets you use your normal skills. The only downside is that it lets you be more off balance while on the monster, so if the monster starts moving around in an aggressive way, you'll want to make sure to hit the grab button again so that you re-cling to them and don't fall off. Extra little tip if you're a thief vocation, if you happen to have the ensnare skill equipped, you can actually yoink over smaller enemies, which can be very useful for dealing with harpies if you don't have a ranged attacker. If you happen to be fighting multiple enemies at once, I would highly advise you to take care of the smaller enemies first, as they can still knock you off balance, which will not be good news if a larger enemy happens to be charging up a big attack. So it's important to note that even though the enemies might be smaller, they can still give you a large headache, but they are easier to deal with, so I would just recommend taking out monsters from small to big. Also, if you happen to find yourself in trouble with bigger monsters, you can actually have semi-immortality by timing your heals so that if you happen to hit 0 on your health bar, you can quickly heal back some amount and it will actually keep you alive. And you can do this by doing it the long way in your items section, or you can also use your quick healing items to do this too. As a general note, I would recommend your pawn comp be pretty balanced. And by the way, I'm coining that term pawn comp, feel free to use it. If you happen to face certain monsters like golems or slimes, which are immune to magic damage and physical damage respectively, then I would recommend you have pawns that cover those weaknesses. You can always have a full team of sorcerers, but you're not going to be able to deal with a golem very effectively. And as you progress the story and get into later game areas, you're going to want to upgrade your weapons. And weapon progression in Dragon's Dogma 2 is very linear, meaning you can usually get upgraded weapons the further along in the story you are by visiting different shops. However, if you do want to directly upgrade your weapons, there's an option for that too, and there are 4 different categories. We have Vermundian, we have Elvish, we have Battalion, and Dwarven. Now, Dwarven is unlocked in a later game story, but Vermundian, Elvish, and Battalion are unlocked as soon as you visit them. Vermundian is balanced, Elvish focuses on magic and magic defense, and Batal focuses on strength and defense. Now, Dwarven is essentially what Vermundian is, except that it also boosts knockdown power and knockdown resistance. And generally, I believe that it's also the best one. So if you have late game weapons that seem strong that you want to upgrade, I would highly recommend you use Dwarven. But if you want the absolute best out of your weapons and you're playing in the post game, then you can actually use Warm Life crystals to upgrade your weapons even further. And using this upgrade with the Dragon Forge will halve your weight and make your weapons much more effective. Now, this requires weapons tends to be fully upgraded, so of course use Dwarven before this, and Worm's Life crystals can drop off of drakes and lesser dragons. They're also worth quite a lot, so if you want to farm them out for cash, you can also do that. Moving on, if you happen to find an NPC that you want to increase your affinity with, not only can you get extra rewards, but you can also affect certain points of the story. So if you want to increase your affinity with someone, you can always give them gifts in order to do so. When you've maxed out a character's affinity, they will show a heavy blushing effect whenever you talk to them, so that's how you know it's maxed out. If you're having trouble finding out what an NPC likes to be given, you can always check your NPC log, which will then show you the preferred gifts. I have found that bunches of flowers usually work pretty well. Also, make sure you're doing all the side quests you can as well, as you can actually unlock some pretty cool bonuses if you do some of them. For example, if you help out this little apothecary girl by giving her some fruit roberant, you can actually visit her and her grandfather later in Vernworth, and he will give you a 20% discount at their shop. This also bleeds into yet another side quest, so it'll save you money in the long run. Every so often, you're going to want to rest at an inn, not only to check in your pawn for any rewards, but also to create a hard save point whenever you quit your game. The game saves in two states. You have your regular save, which is covered by autosave and manual save, and then you have inn saves. Both inn saves and regular saves will make a mark on your profile so that whenever you want to load back into the game, you can load into either of those two. And this will be especially important much later on in the late story, so make sure you pay attention to inn saves. And finally, and this is a big one, the big Talos fight that you face towards the end of the main story is actually completely skippable. As revealed by Mortismal Gaming when he did his full review, you can actually just completely rest through this. I'm sure many of you have figured out, if you've played this section by now, that the fight is actually required and it won't actually affect the outcome of the story because he always gets stopped. So if you want to wander around and go do something else in the meantime and then let him get destroyed of his own accord by a cutscene, then feel free. And that, my friends, is 50+ tips that you can use in Dragon's Dogma 2. Thank you guys so much for watching. As a final tip, I would recommend that you subscribe and like the video so that it helps me out, and you can also catch more Dragon's Dogma 2 content in the future. But with that, thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you again real soon.